Session 867. The evening was very humid but cool after a late afternoon thunderstorm. Jane felt the humidity as we sat for the session. She had no questions for Seth, but expected him to continue his material of last Wednesday night, when he started an answer to my question about the relationship between the host organism and disease. This idea had come to her pretty strongly after supper. "It won't be dictation. I think there's a whole lot more, but you know it's not quite here yet," she said. Neighbors stopped in at 8:45, however, and Jane explained afterwards that because of the visit, brief as it was, the material had retreated away from her internal perceptions somewhat. "So I'm just waiting for it to come forward again," she said. When it did, Seth followed the non-book portion of the last session. Well, that we want to include in mass events, finally. Now, good evening. Good evening, Seth. I can be perplexed, and it was my perplexity that Rupert felt, for there is indeed much information that I want to give you along certain lines, and yet I must contend with modes of thought that are habitual to you, and those modes make it difficult for you to combine various elements of speculation. As always, I will do the best that I can, using concepts with which you are familiar, at least to begin. I realize that current experience may perhaps seem contradictory to some of these ideas, so bear with me. I will therefore combine the idea of a disease with the idea of creativity, for the two are intimately connected. Briefly, remember analogies I have made in the past, comparing the landscape of physical experience to the painter's landscape, which may be dark, gloomy, filled with portents of disasters, and yet still be a work of art. In that regard, every person paints his or her own portrait in living color, a portrait that does not simply sit in a tranquil pose on a table, but one that has the full capacity for action. Those of you now living, say, are in the same life class. You look about to see how your contemporaries are getting along with their portraits, and you find multitudinous varieties: tragic self-portraits, heroic self-portraits, comic self-portraits. And all of these portraits are alive and interacting, and as they interact, they form the planetary, mass, social, and political events of your world. These portraits obviously have a biological reality. In a manner of speaking, now, each person dips into the same supplies of paint and so forth, which are the elements out of which your likenesses emerge. There must be great creative leeway allowed for such portraits. Each one interacting with each other one helps form the psychological and physical reality of the species. So you are somehow involved in the formation of a multitudinous number of portraits. I simply want you to keep that analogy in the background. These portraits, however, are the result of creativity so inborn and miraculous that they are created automatically. An automatic art. At certain levels, the species is always creatively embarked upon alternate versions of itself. The overall patterns will remain. Biological integrity is everywhere sustained. What you think of as diseases, however, are quite creative elements working at different levels, and at many levels at once. Many viruses are vital to physical existence, and in your terms, there are gradations of activity, so that only under certain conditions do viruses turn into, say, what you think of as deadly ones. The healthiest body contains within it many so-called deadly viruses in what you may call an inactive form. Inactive from your viewpoint, in that they are not causing disease. They are, however, helping to maintain the body's overall balance. In a way, in each body, the species settles upon a known status quo, and yet experiments creatively at many levels, with cellular alterations, chromosomal variations, so that of course each body is unique. There are kinds of gradations, say in the lines and the kinds of diseases. Certain diseases can actually strengthen the body from a prior, weaker state by calling upon the body's full defenses. Under certain conditions, some so-called disease states could ensure the species' survival. Give us a moment. It is very difficult to explain. In a way, some disease states help to ensure the survival of the species, not by weeding out the sickly, but by introducing into large numbers of individuals the conditions needed to stabilize other strains within the species that need to be checked, or to naturally inoculate the species against a sensed greater danger. At the minute level, microscopic levels, there are always some biological experiments being carried out in a creative effort to give the species as much leeway as possible for effective action. Your body is changed biologically by your thoughts. Your culture has its biological effect upon the species. I am not speaking of obvious connections in a derogatory manner, such as pollution and so forth. If you were thinking in old terms of evolution, then I would be saying that your cultures and civilizations actually alter the chromosomal messages. Your thoughts affect your cells, again, and they can change what are thought of as hereditary factors. Give us a moment. Your imaginations are intimately connected with your diseases, just as your imaginations are so important in all other areas of your life. You form your being by imaginatively considering such and such a possibility, and your thoughts aided your body in that regard. In a way, illness is a tool used on behalf of life, for people have given it social, economic, psychological, and religious connotations. It becomes another area of activity and of expression. I have told you that at microscopic levels there is no rigid self-structure like your own. There is identity. A cell does not fear its own death. Its identity has traveled back and forth from physical to non-physical reality too often as a matter of course. It sings with the quality of its own life. It cooperates with other cells. It affiliates itself with the body of which it is a part, but in a way it lends itself to that formation. The dreams of the species are highly important to its survival, not just because dreaming is a biological necessity, but because in dreams the species is immersed in deeper levels of creativity, so that those actions, inventions, ideas that will be needed in the future will appear in their proper times and places. In the old terms of evolution, I am saying that man's evolutionary progress was also dependent upon his dreams. Give us a moment. Now, many of the characteristics you consider human, in fact, most of them, appear to one extent or another in all other species. It was the nature of man's dreams, however, that was largely responsible for what you like to think of as the evolution of your species. You learn to dream differently than other creatures. I thought you would like that quotation. You dreamed you spoke languages before their physical invention, of course. It was the nature of your dreams and of your dreams' creativity that made you what you are, for otherwise you would have developed a mechanical-like language, had you developed one at all, that named designations, locations, and dealt with the most simple, objective reality. I walked there, he walked there, the sun is hot. You would not have had that kind of bare statement of physical fact. You would not have had any way of conceiving of objects that did not already exist. You would not have had any way of imagining yourselves in novel situations. You would not have had any overall picture of the seasons, for dreaming educated the memory and lengthened man's attention span. It reinforced the lessons of daily life and was highly important in man's progress. Using the intellect alone, man did not simply learn through daily experience over the generation, say that one season followed the other. He lived too much in the moment for that. In one season he dreamed of the others, however, and in dreams he saw himself spreading the seeds of fruits as he had seen the wind do in daily life. His dreams reminded him that a cold season had come and would come again. Most of your inventions came in, in dreams, and again, it is the nature of your dreams that makes you so different from other species. Give us a moment. The creativity of the species is also the result of your particular kind of dream specialization. It amounts to a unique state of existence by itself in which you combine the elements of physical and non-physical reality. It is almost a threshold between the two realities, and you learn to hold your physical intent long enough at that threshold so that you have a kind of brief attention span there, and use it to draw from non-physical reality precisely those creative elements that you need. Animals, as a rule, are less physically oriented in their dreaming states. They do dream of physical reality, but much more briefly than you. Otherwise, they immerse themselves in dreams in different kinds of dreaming consciousness that I hope to explain at a later date. End of session, but I will continue with the material. I bid you a fond good evening, and we have opened up a fine kettle of metaphysical fish. Very good. Good night, Seth, and thank you. I've indicated but a few of the many long pauses Jane took while speaking for Seth. In fact, this session had been her slowest one in many months. Now I see why I feel so puzzled before the session, she said. Even with the company, I just had to sit there and wait for things to be put together in a new way. It was really funny. She paused. Then I seem to get things that are different toward the ends of books, like where one is leading into the next one. Take the idea of the book Seth mentioned on therapy and value fulfillment and so forth, and what you said today about body consciousness. Everything's related. Today I'd mentioned to Jane how I remembered Seth saying, perhaps a couple of years ago, that still untouched in his material is the whole question of the body consciousness and its role in health and many other fields. Seth had indicated that he had available a vast amount of material on the body consciousness, and that he could give it to us at any time. I've been curious about the subject ever since. Now, however, when I remarked that I liked tonight's material on dreaming and language, Jane replied, I wish you hadn't said that. As soon as you did, I felt a circle of information open up, a lot of it, about when ancient man had a series of mass dreams in which he learned how to speak. The dreams were like glossolalia, speaking in unintelligible speech sounds, yet they made sense, and men began to speak. Then a minute later, another thing I just got was that when man was with other men in the physical world, he could point to stuff to share descriptions with others, but that he learned to really speak when he tried to describe dreams. It was the only way, speech, by which he could share data that couldn't be seen. He could point to a tree and grunt, but there wasn't anything in a dream he could point to. He had to have a method of expression to describe invisible things. Inventions could have come about with it when he tried to tell others what he saw in his dreams, too. Part 4. The Practicing Idealist. Chapter 10. We're getting, I think 10 is the last chapter of this book. The good, the better, and the best. Value fulfillment versus competition. Once again, Jane was uncomfortable because of the very humid evening. As we prepared for the session, I mentioned that I wouldn't mind if Seth commented on a particularly vivid dream I'd had last night. I'd written a detailed account of it upon arising, as I do with all dreams, I recall, and Jane had read it as we ate breakfast. I wasn't sure that she heard me now, though. I think Seth's going to add a part 4 to this book, she said, and he's going to call it The Practicing Idealist. And I want to keep changing it to Practicing Idealism, because his heading sounds too much like it's already been used. Wasn't that a book? I think it might have been written by a political figure, though I'm not sure. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Dictation. The Practicing Idealist. Pause. New chapter 10. The good, the better, and the best. Value fulfillment versus competition. Give us a moment. Most readers of this book can be considered idealists in one way or another by themselves or others. Yet certainly in these pages we have presented several pictures of social and political realities that are far from ideal. We have tried to outline for you many beliefs that undermine your private integrity as individuals and contribute to the very definite troubles current in the mass world. Very few people really act, again, from an evil intent. Any unfortunate situations in the fields of medicine, science, or religion result not from any determined effort to sabotage the ideal, but instead happen because men often believe that any means is justified in the pursuit of the ideal. When science seems to betray you in your society, it does so because its methods are unworthy of its intent, so unworthy and so out of line with science's prime purpose that the methods themselves almost amount to an insidious, anti-scientific attitude that goes all unrecognized. The same applies to medicine, of course, when in its worthy purpose to save life, its methods often lead to quite unworthy experimentation, so that a life is destroyed for the sake of saving, say, a greater number of lives. On the surface level, such methods appear sometimes regrettable but necessary, but the deeper implications far outdo any temporary benefits, for through such methods men lose sight of life's sacredness and begin to treat it contemptuously. You will often condone quite reprehensible acts if you think they were committed for the sake of a greater good. You have a tendency to look for outright evil, to think in terms of the powers of good and evil, and I am quite sure that many of my readers are convinced of evil's force. Evil does not exist in those terms, and that is why so many seemingly idealistic people can be partners in quite reprehensible actions, while telling themselves that such acts are justified, since they are methods toward a good end. That is why fanatics feel justified in their actions. When you indulge in such black and white thinking, you treat your ideals shabbily. Each act that is not in keeping with that ideal begins to unravel the ideal at its very core. As I have stated several times, if you feel unworthy or powerless to act, and if you are an idealist, you may begin to feel that the ideal exists so far in the future that it is necessary to take steps you might not otherwise take to achieve it. And when this happens, the ideal is always eroded. If you want to be a true practicing idealist, then each step that you take along the way must be worthy of your goal. In your country, the free enterprise system originated, changed the word to immersed, is immersed in strange origins. It is based upon the democratic belief in each individual's right to pursue a worthy and equitable life. But that also became bound up with Darwinian ideals of the survival of the fittest, and with the belief, then, that each individual must seek his or her own good at the expense of others, and by the quite erroneous conception that all of the members of a given species are in competition with each other, and that each species is in further competition with each other species. The laws of supply and demand are misconceptions based upon a quite uncomplimentary belief in man's basic greedy nature. In the past, you treated the land in your country as if your species, being the fittest, had the right to survive at the expense of all other species and at the expense of the land itself. The idea of the country was and is an excellent one. The right of each individual to pursue an equitable, worthy existence with dignity. The means, however, have helped erode that ideal, and the public interpretation of Darwin's principles was, quite unfortunately, transferred to the economic arena and to the image of man as a political animal. Religion and science alike denied other species any real consciousness. When man spoke of the sacredness of life in his more expansive moods, he referred to human life alone. You are not in competition with other species, nor are you in any natural competition with yourselves. Nor is the natural world in any way the result of competitiveness among species. If that were the case, you would have no world at all. Individually, you exist physically because of the unsurpassed cooperation that exists just biologically between your species and all others, and on deeper levels, because of the cellular affiliations that exist among the cells of all species. Value fulfillment is a psychological and physical propensity that exists in each unit of consciousness, propelling it toward its own greatest fulfillment in such a way that an individual, I don't know what the hell word is, also, that its individual accomplishment also adds to the best possible development on the pale of each other such unit of consciousness. This propensity operates below and within the framework of matter. It operates above as well, but I am here concerned with the cooperative nature with which value fulfillment endows all units of consciousness within your physical world. While you believed in competition, then competition became not only a reality but an ideal. Children are taught to compete against each other. The child naturally competes against herself or himself in an urge to outdo old performance with new. Competition, however, has been promoted as the ideal at all levels of activity. It is as if you must look at others to see how you are doing. And when you are taught not to trust your own abilities, then of course you need the opinions of others overmuch. I am not speaking of any playful competition, obviously, but of a determined, rigorous, desperate, sometimes almost deadly competition, in which a person's value is determined according to the number of individuals he or she has shunted aside. This is carried through in economics, politics, medicine, the sciences, and even the religions. So I would like to reinforce the fact that life is indeed a cooperative venture, that all the steps taken toward the ideal must of themselves be life-promoting. End of dictation. Seth did discuss my dream of last night, explaining in some detail how I busily constructed a second dream self so that I could carry on a dialogue expressing creative impatience with myself. I was eager to embark upon new ventures in painting and writing, even while I was recording mass events for Jane and Seth and preparing for publication. End of session and a fond good evening. But I didn't want Seth to go yet. Can I ask you another question? You may. Why is Jane so sensitive to the summer weather? As I have said before, Rupert considers summer a time of vacations and beautiful distractions. He does not work well with it. He is afraid that it can lead to laxness. He yearns toward the cool hours, which then become significant. People only respond to the seasons in individualistic fashion, of course, using certain elements to spur them on or hold them back, using the sessions as sounding boards. No season is of itself only. It exists in relationship to all the people within its boundaries, and Rupert enjoys summer thoroughly, the cooler hours being used as a contrast. End of session. Okay, thank you. Again, a fond good evening. The same to you, good night. Session 869. Just 2 months ago I mentioned in the 857th session that Seth was continuing to dictate material for mass events on Wednesday evenings only, with one exception. He'd kept to that policy, setting aside Monday nights for other regular or private information. Even though Seth didn't call last Monday's session book dictation, then Jane and I presented it because his material on viruses, disease, health, and biological experimentation obviously complemented his themes for mass events. The excerpts from tonight's session continue that presentation. First, though, let me explain an odd development. In the opening notes for session 855, which was held May 21st, I wrote that a few days earlier we'd received our complimentary copies of the German translation of Seth Speaks. I added that we expected the Dutch translation of the same book to be published later this year, but that we didn't know just when that would happen. So Jane and I were understandably surprised last Thursday to receive a letter from a reader in Holland, informing us that he had just purchased a copy of the Dutch edition of Seth Speaks. Usually, we're notified well in advance of a book's publication, but not this time, if the event has actually taken place. Could our correspondent have meant the German edition instead? No doubt a confusion of communication had come about. We have no correspondence with the Dutch publisher. Jane called her editor at Prentice Hall, Tarn Mossman, who had no knowledge of the Dutch Seth Speaks being marketed either. He's to check with Aunt Hermes and let us know. Jane and I are pleased, though, since if Seth isn't available yet in 2 foreign languages, he soon will be. On the same day we received the letter from Holland, Jane had heard from somebody. I'm going to skip this part. There wasn't much more, but anyway. Here are the excerpts from tonight's non-book session. Let me change the orientation here. It's always changing up on me here. A small note, for this will be a brief session, to add to your material on disease. All biological organisms know that physical life depends upon a constant transformation of consciousness and form. In your terms, I am saying, of course, that physically death gives life. This biological knowledge is intimately acknowledged at microscopic levels. Even your cells know that their deaths are necessary for the continuation of your physical form. The entire orientation is strange or alien only to your conscious belief systems. In one way or another, most people are aware of a desire for death before they die, a desire they usually do not consciously acknowledge. To a large measure, the sensations of pain are also the result of your beliefs, so that even diseases that are indeed accompanied now by great pain need not be. Obviously, I am saying that deadly viruses do not think of themselves as killers any more than a cat does when it devours a mouse. The mouse may die, and a cell might die as a result of the virus, but the connotations applied to such events are also the results of beliefs. In the greater sphere of spiritual and biological activity, the viruses are protecting life at their level and in the capacity given them. In one way or another, they are always invited, again, always invited, in response to that greater rhythm of existence in which physical life is dependent upon constant transformation of consciousness and form. Some early chapters in our latest book, Mass Events, throw light on reasons other than biological ones for such circumstances. Give us a moment. The phase of death is, then, a part of life's cycle, I mentioned evolutionary experiments as you think of evolution. There is a disease you read about recently where the skin turns leathery after intense itching. A fascinating development in which the human body tries to form a leathery-like skin that would, if the experiment continued, be flexible enough for, say, sweat pores and normal locomotion, yet tough enough to protect itself in jungle environments from the bites of many still more dangerous insects and snakes. Many such experiments appear in certain stages as diseases, since the conditions are obviously not normal physical ones. To some extent, cancer also represents a kind of evolutionary experiment. But all such instances escape you because you think of so-called evolution as finished. Some varieties of your own species were considered by the animals as diseased animal species, so I want to broaden your concepts there. In the entire natural scheme, and at all levels, even social or economic ones, disease always has its own creative basis. Abnormalities of any kind in birth always represent probable versions of the species itself, and they are kept in the gene pool to provide a never-ending bank of alternates. There are all kinds of interrelationships. So-called mongoloid children, for example, are reminders of man's purely emotional heritage as separate from his intellectual achievements. They often appear more numerously in industrialized civilizations for that reason. In our next book, we will try to acquaint people with the picture of their true nature as a species as they exist independently of their belief systems. We will hope to show man's origin as existing in an inner environment and emphasize the importance of dreams in evolutionary advancement and as the main origin of man's most creative achievements. End of session, and a fond good evening. Okay, Seth. Good night. Boy, how he got all that out of me, I don't know, Jane laughed, for she had been very relaxed before the session. Her delivery had moved right along. I've deleted a few portions of the session that don't apply to disease and evolutionary experimentation. Jane reported that when Seth gave the material on I don't even know that word, on onchocerciasis, something about the skin, she really felt that the people's skins were trying to turn into some sort of leathery protection. I don't know whether I got those sensations from Seth, picked them up on my own, or just created them myself to go along with the material. She hadn't been aware of any feelings involving her own skin. For the last 5 weeks, Jane had been intrigued by ideas about Seth's next book, which she said would concern the therapy of value fulfillment. Seth had also used the phrase in connection with a next work. Now, it appears that he's settled upon a formal title for his book, one that Jane has received from him several times lately. Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment. Okay, I see that I am at 32 minutes, 33 almost. I will end this session for now. This is the Dove Lady, over and out for now.